Because look at what we call the Arab Spring. I don't call it the Arab Spring. It's at the best an Arab awakening. People are now understanding that they can remove dictators, and that's good. Beyond this, I'm not sure that we are going very far. But if you look at what is happening, you will see something which is very worrying about the reality of the countries. Look at the way the Tunisians are dealing with the issue. Tunisians are dealing with Tunisia, Egyptians with Egypt, Libyans with Libya. There is something which is very nationalistic in the whole process. We look at our country. And the point is that there will be no real liberation in the Middle East if we carry on speaking about one country and one country. It should be a dynamic movement, regional movement, helping all together. A transnational movement and a national movement could only be a country which is democratically under control economically. If we don't get it's complex, this situation. So in our world, we really have to go a step further by asking, how do we protect a civil state in the region? Is it possible to protect the civil state on its own, or do we need to have a regional comprehensive dynamic that is protecting the way we are dealing with power? These are questions that are very, very much practical and not theoretical, that, oh, let us talk about one civil state. We think that we are talking about transparency, and in fact nothing is transparent because the centers of power are no longer in the state. The nation state today is a notion of the past, if we don't add to the nation state all the other parameters that are so important. And you know, one of the parameters is what we call the fourth power, which today is media. Media is very powerful on the state itself. You have politicians at the state level, they are much more involved in media politics than in good governance, if you understand what I mean. It's not far from you. Anyway, so this is the reality of our world. Media politics is how do you play with, covering the events and not the reality of having a policy. And centers of power are the way you deal with media. You can keep a very strong authority in the state if you keep a very strong authority on communication within the state. So these are very important. You can let the people speak and have an upper end of who is speaking and where. So the means of communication in our societies today are very strong and stronger, and this is why there is something which is important that we have to study, is the alternative media. Is how do you use, now internet in a way that you can counter the authority of the state on some means of communication, or official means of communication. So we have to look at this, and these are three main problems as an introduction that I wanted to start with, in order to understand where all the concepts, how the concept was used, and in which way it is distinguishing religious state, military state, perception, understanding of how power is distributed, and how power is a mandate that is given in a bottom-up process in the civil state versus a top-down reality. Now, if you come to the Islamic reference, and we try to understand, okay, we got this from the West, and once again, I'm very sorry, in 45 minutes, it's difficult to get the whole idea. It's just an introduction. Meaning by this, when I say it's an introduction, that what you have to do as citizens, what you have to do as thinkers, what you have to do as activists, is not to come back to YouTube after this lecture, but to come back to books and to read about it. If you want to be intellectually strong, you have to be intellectually equipped. And if you want to be intellectually equipped, is to diversify your sources of knowledge. And you have to take from all this other tradition the way they are dealing with this. The problem is that we have Muslims that are very ambitious as what they want today to do, and very lazy is what they have to do with their mind. If you know what I mean. Now, if we come to the Islamic reference, there is something which is very important when it comes to how do we deal with power as Muslims. Because behind the discussion about the civil state is how do we deal with power? How do we deal with authority? And this is where what I said yesterday, and very, very quickly you can come back to what I said yesterday, but I just want to summarize some of the points that, through the discussion about authority, some of the points that I made. And this is very interesting in the discussion that we have with secularists and people who are dealing with this opposition between secular versus religion in the Western paradigm and in the Western references. In Islam, if you come to the very essence of what the scholars, and it's very interesting to understand in Islam that the first Islamic science was Islamic law. It was not theology. We're not having a discourse on God. Because in Islam, the starting point is you only can say about God what God is saying about himself. And by the way, I say this in Penang as it has been said everywhere. When I speak English and I speak about God, I speak about Allah, I use God. When I speak in French, I use Dieu. And when I speak in Arabic, it's Allah. And it's one God and no other God. And different language means different words. All the people who are coming with a discussion about could you use Allah, not Allah, and you know, for someone who is coming from Egypt, I would say that this discussion that you had in this country is so simplistic and completely out of touch with the reality. Christians were using Allah much before the Muslims were coming to in Egypt, because in Arabic, God is Allah. So what is the point saying you don't have to use this word because it's our? We are monopolizing words now. Because it means that we are not consistent with our own confidence with our language. So I know that some literalists are saying, well, even when you speak in English, you have to use Allah to speak about the one God. But this is not the reality. Your God is our God. As Muslims, we believe that Allah, God, sent Musa alayhi salam, Isa alayhi salam, Moses and Jesus and all the prophets. And we don't have a problem because he told us in the Quran that the diversity of languages is a sign of his presence. So now we are showing a kind of inferiority complex with languages because we are not confident with our principles. And it can be seen in the way we talk. And in the way we don't want others to talk. Don't use our words. Use the words you want. We don't have a problem with this because our principles should be clear. Now, having said that, when it comes to the way we deal with power in Islam, it's important to understand two things that were there from the very beginning. As the scholars, the fuqaha, the jurists were dealing with law. And when you deal with law, which is the first science in Islam, as I was saying, theology, in fact, there is no real theology in Islam. Because what you can say is, if you want to talk about God, you have to come back to the Quran. He is telling us, لَيْسَ كَمِثْلِهِ شَيْءٌ وَهُوَ السَّمِيعُ الْبَصِيرُ. There is nothing like him, and he is the most, he can hear everything, and he can see everything. Telling us, if you want to speak about God, come to what God is saying about himself. Al-Quran was Sunnah. You cannot just start now imagining things because you have no idea about who he is. Even in the Quran, sometimes he's saying he, sometimes he's saying I, and sometimes he's saying we. Just to tell us, don't reduce God to your own masculine and feminine. He's beyond this. So you might be intellectually humble in the way you speak about God. So first science is law. And when you deal with law, you deal with power. Law is power, of course. And this is where the scholars had to decide who is deciding on law. Who decides? And this is where they came with a distinction, which is critical in Islam. The distinction between the verses that we have in the Quran that are telling us, here you don't decide. Here is sami'na wa ata'na. We heard and we obey.